Welcome everybody to Fern's Holistic ASMR. Thank you for tuning into my channel, and today I'm kindly joined by Melissa from ASMR Beauty, who also happens to be my daughter and is guiding me through the early days of me contributing to hopefully what you feel are some wonderful holistic therapy, massages, and also some general discussion on health and well-being. As a result of the channel and lots of feedback from all of you and some absolutely wonderful comments on what I'm doing, I was commenting the other day at how many of the comments referred to how I was helping individuals cope with the stress of everyday life. And I said to Melissa, I would really like to reach out and talk to people about stress, what stress is, and actually how to manage it. And the advice was, well, actually, why don't you just talk about and share your knowledge of how the knowledge that you have on stress and how you have dealt with that in your own life as well, which I will touch on. And while I'm doing this, hopefully you'll find this calm massage on the hair and scalp part of that, helping you to relax while you listen. Right, I'm just going to take a hairbrush and slowly get rid of any knots that we've got in the hair. All seem to be situated down the bottom. Just so that we get a nice, even glide through while I'm gathering my thoughts and getting my thoughts together about what I want to talk to you about. And I really hope some of these comments, which are based on my previous studies and my own life experience, will help somebody just understand that you can manage your stress. But understanding a little bit more about stress and how to manage it can really help with your sense of well-being. That's lovely. So the problem we have with stress is it's been identified as the most serious health problem of the 21st century. Stress isn't all bad. It can be very positive. It can give you adrenaline when you need it. But if it's not managed, it can be a real problem. Stress, I would say, is a normal, healthy response to situations. And the body is constantly trying to maintain, what's the correct word? Internal stability. And that, the formal word for that is homeostasis. So if you think about things, if it's a hot day outside, the body tries to cool itself down, and it's got the ability to do that. If you get a cut or you graze yourself, the body tries to heal itself. It forms like a scab over the cut and then tries to heal itself before it scars. And that's the body's ability to try and heal itself. So when you get stressful situations, the body actually has what's known as a biochemical response to those stressors. It tries to put itself back into that pre-stressful state. Now, the problem we've got in the modern world is that it can do that for a few times, and it can do that for maybe a short period. But actually, if you take it too far, you get the inability to cope via that biochemical response, and it starts causing reactions in the body. Right, I'm just going to put the comb through Melissa's hair, just because I can feel it tugging a little bit, just so that I can carry on the smoothness while I'm talking without my fingers getting caught up. And what I want to do is get you into a relaxed state as well while you're listening. One thing we have to be very careful of is bombarding the body with these stressful situations, because obviously you're going to get a reaction, and that's the human body reacting to the stress. So, what exactly is stress? And I've been asked that question a number of times, and I remember studying this many years ago and actually being quite shocked at what exactly stress is. And it really is the experience, the pressure that we experience in situations that threaten us. And it's really surprising what those situations are and how quickly they can actually build up. So it can overwhelm us, and in particular with our well-being, leave us unable to cope. And what I'm hoping with some of the things I talk about is that I can give you a few ways of coping with those stressors. And actually, do you know, one of the main ways of coping with the stress is actually being aware of what stress is, what causes it, and then what you can do to try and cope better with it, to stop it actually happening. And each person is very different in how they react to certain situations. You know, you can have a conversation with somebody and you're really quite upset about something, and somebody will say to you, well, I don't really understand what the issue is. So stress can be quite perception based, so it's your understanding and how it impacts your body that's important. So that means there are different ways of learning how to cope with it, and every single person can have a different way of how they cope with this. A certain amount of stress, don't get me wrong, can be a positive thing. It's just too much stress can lead to problems, and that's what we don't want in our lives. If we're not careful, the stress and our inability to cope with it can lead to health issues. And that is one thing I've always been on a mission to really try and relieve. When I previously had my little room at the back of my house, that is one of the great rewards that I got, was actually helping people to cope better with stress through treatments and just talking to people generally about the sense of well-being that you can get from things that I was doing, such as therapies. Okay, I'm just going to brush this through, comb this through. There we go. Okay, so one of the ways of, as I said, coping with stress is having an understanding of what stress actually is. And stress, the different types of stress, this always surprises me, can be divided into particular types of stress. And sometimes we don't think of them as stress until they've actually caused us an issue. So things like environmental stress. This is an interesting one. This is what's called everyday stresses. So we can normally cope, normally don't have a problem coping with everyday stress. But sometimes this just builds up and builds up. So if you think of some examples, and I know some people have experienced this excessively recently, getting to work, something that you expect is quite easy to do, getting to work, maybe jumping on the train, driving to the station, and then just day in, day out, there's roadworks. And actually, for the odd few days, we can probably cope with that quite well. But after a while, it gets irritating and the frustration seeps in. You need to find ways of really coping with that sort of stress. Another environmental aspect could be job changes. That was often a big one that people used to talk to me about. Simple things like your job changes. You have maybe different colleagues in, or the type of work you're doing actually changes. And maybe your work becomes more demanding. And as with any stress, you can cope with it for a while. But if it's too much, in particular if you're being asked to do too much, you need to find a way, an outlet of coping with those extra demands on your body. Because although they're what we call environmental stressors, they will have a physical impact. For example, if your work becomes so much that you can't cope with it, it actually presents in illnesses. And I'm talking potentially serious illness here, heart issues, palpitations, fatigue, insomnia. So don't mean to sound very negative there, but if we're not careful, that's what it can lead to, and then some really serious issues. We've all heard the word burnout, and that's really what this means. If you can't cope with the stress, that could lead to burnout. And we don't want that. We want to really work at avoiding that, getting our time pressures right, getting that balance right between work and family, not over juggling, somehow working out how to manage our time effectively, working out financial problems with people who can help you. Even moving from, say, school to college can be a big stressor, not just on who's doing it, but even on the rest of the family. So finding ways of coping with that is so important. Right, so that, as I said, the environmental stress is one method of stress. So another method or type of stress, if you think about it, is the chemical, or what we call nutritional stress. So you've probably heard this one before. Putting harmful substances into your body is not good. So I can talk about the general ones that everybody talks about. So you've got too much caffeine, too much smoking, too much alcohol. They really impact on something called the endocrine system. And that, I know people do regard them as a bit of a crutch, but it puts you in like what we call a permanent state of alert. It's just like, oh my God, my body just needs to have that, and that's not a good state to be in. So obviously thinking about what you're putting into your body is so important, and that's sort of what your GP or your doctor's telling you all the time. So I'm not saying anything different, but it's important that you take that on board and look at what you are putting into your body, because that actually might be a really simple way of undoing some of the harm that stress is causing in your body. I had one client who was, almost like shaking mid-morning, and I actually said, well, are you drinking anything like coffee or something like that? And they said to me, oh yeah, I have about 6 cups of coffee in the morning. And I'm like, okay, I think we found out what the issue is. And they were very grateful for me just pointing that out, because sometimes when you're in that stressful situation, you don't actually realise what you're doing, and the harm that can do. And actually just very small changes like reducing the caffeine intake can really have an impact on how you can cope with the stress a lot better. The other one to be aware of in terms of what you're putting into your body is what we call the nutritional side. So I'm not going to preach about good diets, but that's important. But the other aspect is the vitamin. There are certain vitamins, and lots of research has gone into this really recently. Things like a deficiency in vitamin B12 can cause real harm to the body, and that's very important to have a very good diet to combat that. And actually, if it's already got serious, then obviously that is something that you need to speak to your doctor about. So that's one, nutrition. We're obviously based in the UK, so one of the deficiencies that lots of people have is lack of vitamin D, because we don't get enough sunshine. I know in other countries people don't have that issue, but actually if you get a build-up of this and lack of nutrition, that in itself can cause lots of stresses on the body. The body's trying to compensate for that, and it can't, and you end up getting ill. So being aware of really what you put into your body is so important. Right, now I'm going to talk about one of the final types of stress there is, and that's emotional stress. And while I'm doing that, because as we're talking about emotional stress, I'm just going to do a few Indian head massage moves on this scalp. So one of the biggest causes of emotional stress is relationships. And when I talk about relationships, I mean relationships in general. So it could be relationships with family, could be relationships with friends even, and even with work colleagues. I'm going to do a bit on the scalp here just to relieve some tension. People show their emotions in different ways, and some find it very easy to open up about their emotions, and others just shut up and don't talk about them at all, even if people are asking them, is something wrong? Can I help? Some people just are not built in that way, and they bottle things up. The problem with doing that is, as I said, the body can only cope with so much before it has to have an outlet in some way. And what you want is that outlet to be guided and have a positive outcome. And that's why it's so important. Communication, so important. Getting help when you need it. And in some cases, people learning how to talk with each other. And sometimes we need help and guidance to do that. And I would always advise people who are in that situation to get the right help and advice to do that. So, being unable to cope with stress, and ironically this happens even on happy occasions. It's well known that actually some of the biggest stressors are things like weddings, marriage. Can you believe that? It can cause real stress when it's a happy day for everybody. And the problem is, if you get too stressed, that happy day can turn into a negative one, and you don't want to do that. So you want to find ways to really combat that stress. So, too much stress, what can it lead to? Well, too much stress can lead to particular symptoms, and these are things that we really, really do want to avoid. So, what are some of the things that you need to be aware of and look out for? Just going to brush some of these knots out. Too much stress, as I said, leads to particular symptoms. Some of the examples of this can be feeling really nervous, feeling anxious, feeling actually scared if you've got particular situations that you're trying to react to, moodiness, irritation, and particularly when people are changing their behaviours. Somebody that's nice and sunny and positive suddenly becomes moody and irritable. Hopefully that something's wrong, and hopefully you can address that with them. And as I said, if not, then perhaps persuade them to have some help. Certain situations can lead to things like low self-esteem, or even lack of concentration. Suddenly you think, okay, at work, I've normally been able to cope with a really stressful day, and then when you start asking questions, the person's working, a 60-hour week, 70-hour week, week after week, and there's no way the body can constantly cope with that. But being aware of that and when to say no is so important in this very, very hectic life that we lead in the modern world. You might find that somebody who's never cried before starts crying. You might find that somebody's laugh might change and become like a nervous laugh. And you're sort of looking at them strangely, thinking something's going on with you. And actually sometimes just a conversation, sometimes with a work colleague, just asking, actually, is everything okay? Is everything all right at the moment? It's a bit of an off day. Can I just check in with you? So helpful. I know there are people who don't appreciate it, but actually you'd regret it if you didn't check in with that individual, and you could have done some good. So it's worth asking that question. I'm just going to brush through this hair slowly again because I want to do that plait. Even I find that plait relaxing. Okay, now what are the other stresses? We've been through some of them. symptoms rather. So somebody maybe who hasn't been a drinker before suddenly starts drinking. Obviously that's a fairly obvious one. So you can increase the alcohol intake, so that might be a sign that something's going on. Even daft things like teeth grinding at night is one that I've come across before. And obviously, hopefully the dentist can help you with that, but there are methods and tools that you can use to combat that. But obviously getting to the root cause of what's actually causing the stress is probably a better way of looking at it. You could find that somebody who's getting too stressed, it ends up having sleeping problems or headaches, overly tired. And the other unusual one, people who I used to treat said to me, I think I'm a little bit stressed at the moment, but it's really odd, my back's really hurting, it's really sore, and I'm getting aches and pains. And I said, well, actually that's your body trying to cope with the stress. And actually that's amazing, isn't it? That the body is trying to fight, and it's fighting, and it's causing you pain in your back or your neck or your shoulders. And it's actually the body trying to heal itself by causing you pain. And obviously what you need to do is look at, again, at what's actually causing that stress and the pain. So I've talked quite a bit about, the negative side of stress, but there are ways of obviously combating this and removing the stress, or certainly alleviating it. So the first thing is obviously being aware of the causes that we've talked through, and what you can do to cope better or alleviate stress is very important in this modern hectic life. The stress response that we have is known, and you've probably heard this expression before, the fight or flight response. And this is a natural physical reaction to these stressful situations that we've actually talked about. And the body can cope with these stressful situations up to a point because it tries to really adapt. And some of those symptoms we've talked about is how the body tries to adapt to these stresses. And it can cope for a while. But if it goes on, then you start getting symptoms. And if it goes on for long term, then you can have real illness and burnout as a result. And I've been in that situation where I've really pushed myself to work extremely long hours. And I did start getting physical symptoms as a result. And I was determined to undo the damage that I'd put my body through, really putting work before everything else, and leading to burnout, and learned through bitter experience that that is not a good situation to be in. At the time, and hopefully you can now recognise those symptoms, you need to take action. And that's the best way to recover from these situations. One way is obviously to relax, and relaxation has an immediate impact on that stressful situation. Relaxation comes in many forms, but they all decrease adrenaline levels, and that then lowers your blood pressure, which is a real danger. If your blood pressure remains high, it can get quite serious, and you don't want that. So what can you do? How can you actually relieve these stressful situations? And of course, one of the things I'm going to recommend is holistic treatments. Hardly surprising, as I'm a great believer in them. And actually starting this channel has made me realise how wonderful, once again, these treatments are. It brought me joy in my life previously, and then I had to switch back into a career that was very stressful. And actually doing this channel again has reminded me of why I went and learnt holistic therapies alongside what was a full-time job at the time, because I just enjoy the beauty of holistic therapies and the fact that they can bring such good well-being to people, and the healing properties as well. So regular holistic therapies, and those of you who've seen some of my videos, one of the last ones was self-Indian head massage. So I know a lot of people can't afford therapies because they can be expensive, but hopefully even with that video I've given you one way of relieving stress that is causing headaches, for example, just through some very simple exercises. But there are other things you can do as well. Regular exercise is a big one. If you can find a club or something that maybe socialise and gives you a bit of exercise at the same time, walking or running. Breathing techniques even, learning how to breathe properly, learning how to slow your breathing down can be a really good technique. Meditation even, that's one that has been known to work. Visualising very positive visualisations can really help you cope with stress. And obviously reading up a little bit about these things, anything that appeals to you and you think actually that could work for me, is beneficial. If you can find in your locality Pilates classes, yoga classes, sometimes there's even group meditation that works. Anything that's going to work for you, but literally simply finding other people who share your interests with a little bit of exercise in there as well, such as walking, is going to be beneficial for your health. But above all, doing something and not waiting till the stress becomes too challenging and too difficult to cope with and you end up becoming ill. So you want to take action before that happens. And obviously my best recommendation would be holistic therapies of some sort. Okay, we're coming to the end now, but I hope that I've shared some of my knowledge, and I do hope as a result of that will really help you. Thank you for listening, and I will see you soon.